Hey everybody, it's Don. I'm in Clifton Gorge State Nature Preserve to take a winter walk along the Little Miami River. So let's go see what we can see. Last year I did a cold winter walk in Clifton Gorge, but I went upriver through that in that direction right there. What we're going to do this year is head down river and walk along the lower half of Clifton Gorge State Nature Preserve and see what we can see in that direction. I'm sure we'll see plenty of trees, plenty of rocks. I'm hoping for some good tracks today and perhaps some birds and some other things. So let's take a walk. I don't plan to make today's episode about trees too much because I do a lot of that, right? You can see the limestone walls behind me in Clifton Gorge. But I do need to talk about a few trees, and one very notable tree shortly after you descend into Clifton Gorge here is this really large chinkapin oak. This tree is one of the larger trees in the gorge, in this part of the gorge. And this is chinkapin oak, Quercus muhlenbergii. And I've measured this thing before. I forget exactly what it is, but it's pretty close to 4 feet in diameter. And again, chinkapin oak is an oak that's very abundant throughout the Midwest. It likes limestone soils with limestone bedrock. And that's what we have here. And so there's a lot of chinkapin oaks in this area, and this is a particularly notable one that you'll see right away when you visit this spot. As I mentioned last year when I visited Clifton Gorge, this area is known for its disjunct populations of plant species that are far removed from their normal range. And a couple of those species can be found right in this vicinity, including white cedar and eastern hemlock. So right above me on this cliff face, we have the white cedars. Okay, Thuja occidentalis, and these are all cliff-dwelling species or individuals showing a lot of gravitropism, really interesting, unique forms, and they kind of line the gorge here through Clifton Gorge. And across from me, there's a stand of about 4 to 5 large eastern hemlocks. And the gorge has a very small population of these. It only has about 15 large individuals like that, and maybe another 50 to 60 smaller individuals throughout the gorge. And then beyond that, you've got to go an hour and a half southeast of here to hit the next natural populations of eastern hemlock in Ohio. And so that's a unique feature right here in Clifton Gorge. And the one across from us right there, we studied once and aged that thing at 232 years old. So there's an old growth hemlock right there in front of you. So right behind me, we're at Steamboat Rock. So what Steamboat Rock is what's called a slump block. So it's a large boulder that more or less has broken away from the cliff face, slumped away, if you will, and rolled down or slid down the hill, and it now landed in the river. And now the shape of this rock, basically people thought it looked like a boat in the river, so it got named Steamboat Rock. Here's a little bit of signage about that and that process. Again, these are called slump blocks. So this thing presumably broke off of the cliff up here. We don't know how long ago, could be hundreds, thousands of years ago. But at any rate, it ended up down here and is perched in the middle of the river. A couple things to say about it is, one, things grow on it, right? It's not static, it's not just a big rock. And trees that grow on a spot like that, you could consider that a refuge from things like deer browsing. And because deer basically are not inclined to try to climb up there just to get the few plants they can get on top of this rock. So these kind of little refuge sites are very important for plant establishment where you have like heavy deer pressure, things where they might browse the understory of anything they can access that they'd prefer to eat. So as you can see here, there's a profuse population of white cedars up there, which white-tailed deer will readily eat when they can access them. Okay, so in Clifton Gorge, you find these cedars mostly perched on cliff edges, up along the cliffs, and not so often on the ground. Those on the ground are just large and are often browsed near the base. Okay, so there's Steamboat Rock serving as a refuge for trees. One other bit of lore about Steamboat Rock is that prior to when Clifton Gorge became accessible to the public, it was in private hands. And the owner kind of ran Clifton Gorge like a roadside attraction. And so up in this direction, near the narrow part of the gorge around the bend, there was, you know, a thing like a little roadside stand where they'd sell snacks and drinks, and maybe charge you a buck or a couple bucks to come and walk around through Clifton Gorge and visit the gorge. Now, the owner had a pet black bear. All right, so black bears were long extirpated from this part of Ohio. There are only very occasional visitors to this part of Ohio right now. But apparently this bear was captured when it was young from, I think, Canada, as the story goes, and brought here as a cub, and somehow this fellow acquired this black bear. Anyhow, it lived in the cage at this roadside attraction. And people would feed it snacks and stuff like that, and would drink soda pop, and it was very overweight, apparently. But it was like a pet bear that people came to see. Now, legend is that the owner would periodically let it out of its cage and wander around the gorge, but it would always return, you know, like your cat, if you want to do that with your cat. But one time, at one point, apparently vandals unlocked the cage when the owner was not suspecting, and the owner and I think a friend went out to see what was going on, found the cage unlocked and the bear outside the cage, kind of unauthorized, and tried to get it back in the cage, but it got pretty ornery and fought back, apparently, and then ended up tumbling off the top of the cliff down into the bottom of the cliff, into the gorge, and dying. Okay, and it was, you know, lost for the night or so. I don't know how long it took them to find it, but either the next day or within a few days, its body had washed down the river and washed up against Steamboat Rock, right down here. And so the legend has it then that you know, all the people who cared about this bear, whose name was Muggins, were informed that the bear died, and they were going to do a little ceremony right here, apparently, by the river to cremate it. And so I would only imagine this was a large bear, that they maybe pulled it right to the shore here, and the idea was to burn it, like in a funeral pyre. And people at what was the Dayton Museum of Natural History at the time got word of that. And they rushed out here and caught them all in the act of burning this bear's body, and wanted to see if they could salvage some of it in the name of science. And so they apparently dove in and were only able to extract its head. And so they were able to cut off its head and take its head and clean it up. And the skull of that bear, Muggins, was in the Dayton Museum of Natural History for a long time. And I've seen it there. It's now called the Boonshoff Museum of Discovery. It's more of a children's-oriented kind of facility or institution now. But that's where the remains of Muggins the bear can still be found, somewhere in the collection of the Boonshoff Museum of Discovery. And that's the spot where Muggins' final resting place, essentially, ended up. All right, let's move on. Another iconic thing people come to see, especially this time of year in Clifton Gorge, is this ice fall. So this is just a small waterfall of a small stream or runoff. Only really runs in the fall and winter, spring and winter. It's pretty well dry in the midst of summer, but in the spring when waters are rushing, it's nice, and in the winter you can get this. So we've had a string of quite cold weather for us. It's a pretty warm day today. It's about 34 degrees, but it's been in the teens, and it will be doing that again this coming week. So it's likely this fall will stick around for probably another week or two until there's any substantial melting. And so that's a nice, probably 25, 30 foot tall waterfall here in Clifton Gorge. icefall at this point. When you walk in Clifton Gorge, you have a couple of options. This is, again, the lower half of Clifton Gorge. So we've been walking more or less the river trail, so we're close to the river, but you can walk up and above the rim as well, which we will not do today unless I see anything exciting up there. But there are just a couple of access points where the two join, and so this is one example of that. And this is a point where you can get up on top of the cliff. And you know, it wasn't built as a trail, it was built as a road. And you might wonder, why the heck would there need to be a road to get down in here into Clifton Gorge with these steep walls? This isn't the most efficient travel corridor. Well, it was to access sawmills in their products and supplies needed in the gorge. So there were something like 7 mills at one point. Not just sawmills, excuse me, but grain mills, paper mills, textile mills. One mill remains, which is still active, called Clifton Mill. And then there is the building of Grinnell Mill still standing, which has now been converted into a B&B. But this Clifton Gorge, it looks quite beautiful and natural right now, but back in the 17 and 1800s, it was pretty heavily exploited through timbering and the harnessing the power of the water to grind grain and to cut lumber and so forth. And so right down here, as I make my way, there is some remains or some spots where you can see where a mill was situated. And so there would have been dams along this river at certain points. Some remnants of those dams remain. There was one mill in the narrow part of Clifton Gorge itself that sat right over. The building sat across the gorge. So pretty precarious. It lasted for like 65 years though, so in any case, at this point here, there was a mill here. Let's see if this signage discusses that. Oh, this is just a little bit more about slump blocks and how occasionally they can form caves when a block falls and it leans against another rock. There's somewhat of a cave. It's not a true cave. It would be called a slump block cave. But over here was a point where there was a mill at one point. And although everything is obscured, I see they have the access limited. This is one spot where there was once a mill. There was a dam in place here and a mill race. And I forget exactly what type of mill this one was. Here you can see in the rocks to my right, this little spot right here was a bit of a foundation. You can see some stacked rocks right there. And when you come here without so much snow, there are some things you can see, like joining points on these rocks. Like this, where we're standing right now, I think was possibly part of the mill. You can see it's squared off right below me here. And there are some holes in the rocks where, there were insertions for timbers and so forth. And so this is a spot where there was once a mill. There's a little bit of the rapids here. There is a pretty significant drop in elevation throughout Clifton Gorge from its beginnings in Clifton itself downstream to John Bryan State Park. There's a pretty good drop in elevation. There's some periodic rapids like this. You are not allowed to boat through here. You could only do that really in high water situations, although I think people used to. They used to try to sneak in here to do it. But soon we're going to walk down and see what's called the Blue Hole. I think I'll just keep things running and go see that. This is now an area where the river widens out, slows down, and it creates kind of like a large pond. And it's called the Blue Hole because of the mineral content of this water. Gives it a real bluish appearance in the sunlight. We'll see how that looks today. And this is an often visited and even depicted in paintings and all kinds of things like that spot along the river here. So we'll get there if I don't fall first. One thing about these kinds of conditions, we've gotten about 12 inches of snow in total in the last week or so. And it's gotten packed down by enough visitors here that it's hard packed and slippery and kind of icy. So it's, if you come here, just beware of that at this time of the year. But as you can see, partly by just the sound alone, the river's really slowed down here. And here's a kind of the blue hole pond formed by that. And again, downstream, there's just sort of an accumulation of rocks that have rolled down from the cliffs and that kind of contribute to a sort of a dam, you could say. Here are slump blocks on the edges of Clifton Gorge. You can see covered by those white cedars where deer can't access them. I don't know exactly how deep this is out in the middle there, but this is the famous blue hole. It's quite peaceful. All right, now my other goal was to see what kind of tracks we can maybe see today, but we've gotten enough snow and I can see that the animals haven't come out in force yet to you know, traverse along the river and such where you can often see them. So I'm not seeing a whole lot in that regard. But one thing I am seeing over here is, well, let me reveal it to you in just a second. These things just won't go away, even though they're supposed to. And those are Canada geese. So these are clearly non-migratory Canada geese. Increasingly, these geese, which used to migrate south in the winter, are sticking around in these northern areas because it just doesn't get as cold as it used to. We are in a cold snap, but this has become kind of rare for us these days in southwestern Ohio. So they're out there still living their best life. And taking advantage of the peaceful blue hole at the moment. Okay, let's keep going. As I head toward the border with John Bryan State Park and the bridge that crosses the river, I'm seeing a little patch of bluebirds, if you will. Okay, that's plant speak mixed with bird speak. 4 or 5 bluebirds were just hanging about right here, flying around. This GoPro doesn't do them justice, but they were gathered on this shrub right here, which I hate to say, unfortunately, is a multiflora rose. So they were apparently hanging around collecting these fruits and feeding on it. And that's how, of course, that stuff gets dispersed. It also illustrates the conundrum of some invasive species in that they do feed birds. They do feed other animals in some cases. They are caterpillar food in some cases. They do feed pollinators in some cases. Maybe not better than the native plants that ought to be here, but they do provide some services in that regard. But the question is, do the negative aspects counterbalance any positive aspects that they provide? And again, given that many of these species are here to stay, we're probably not going to be getting rid of them. So I think an investigation of what ecosystem services they do play could be valuable in deciding how to manage some of these things. All right, so this is the bridge, the North Bridge. There's another one of these about a mile downstream in John Bryan. And this bridge represents the border between John Bryan State Park to the south and Clifton Gorge State Nature Preserve to the north. And so this is a neat spot to stop. In the summer, you can often look down at this spot and see snakes hanging out in these rocks, basking and things like that. There are beavers throughout the gorge here. You'll see evidence that beavers are visiting. And so I do want to try to at least get down to the edge of the river over here to see if we can see some tracks of any sort. And again, as I'm discussing in the background, I'm seeing bluebirds flying around. I see various woodpeckers, which will not show, unfortunately, on this GoPro at any distance. But that's a little view of the North Bridge of John Bryan State Park at the border of Clifton Gorge State Nature Preserve. So let's walk over here, see if we can get down near the river and see if that gives us anything interesting to see. Again, in deep snow, it can be tough to track animals because they step down, and as they pull their foot out, the snow drops in, and so that kind of prevents identification of lots of different kinds of tracks. But sometimes when you get down near a river's edge where more animals are visiting, you can you know, see some tracks where the snow's been beaten down a little bit. So in the name of science, I'm going to visit the river's edge here and see if we can see anything in that regard. Now, there's certainly tracks down here. I have a feeling that most of these are pet dogs, people visiting, taking a walk. But, you know, again, these borders, the animals that might be traversing the river, either swimming in it or they're walking along the river's edge, maybe a little bit in the water, sometimes up on the bank. Here is a stem while I'm down here that's been chewed by beavers. Okay, there's a beaver stick. All right, strip the bark, cut by beaver. There is a low dam across this river at just right below the south bridge of John Bryan State Park. And over in neighboring Glen Helen Nature Preserve, there's a large dam over there, very active. But there are beavers all along the river here as well. So while I'm over here, there's one other feature I wanted to show you that is, I think it's a little bit too far out of my range for the moment. So, okay, so let's keep going and see what else we can see. To orient you where we're walking today, let's take a look at the map. Here's the map of Clifton Gorge. Everything you see here in green is State Nature Preserve, which you can only access without a permit along the trail system. So we entered the preserve up here near the Nature Center and dropped down into the gorge, and we took a trail shown in purple here known as the John Rich Trail. So we've been skirting along the river on that trail, and we are currently right here at F, excuse me, where we adjoin John Bryan State Park. And then we're gonna head up on top of the North Rim Trail, but I'm just gonna walk that back fairly quickly. So I'll stop here and there if I see some sights, but this is just an idea of where we have been. Now, all of this area in Clifton Gorge, you cannot access without a permit, but you can get a permit for scientific reasons or other reasons. And I have accessed that point before with permission. And so specifically to get to the other side of the gorge, where some of the trees we've studied can be found. All right, so we're gonna head up on top of the rim trail, see if there are a few highlights, and make our way back to the parking area. My chief highlight up here on the North Rim Trail is I see some better tracks. I've finally seen some interesting things to show you. And so let's take a look at what's up here. It's just a lot more activity up here than down by the river. Now, there are deer tracks everywhere. Okay, so this is just a group of deer tracks. Actually, these are heading in that direction. And interestingly, the cliff edge is just beyond where I'm pointing there. There was a whole group you could see rushed right to the cliff edge. And I was thinking, did these things actually jump off this cliff? No, they didn't. They were smart enough to turn around and head back inward here. But imagine running around these woods at night when it's pitch black and getting scared by something and bolting toward that cliff edge. You know, they're pretty smart because you don't find deer laying at the bottom of the cliff too often. So somehow they keep from killing themselves. Now, there's deer tracks everywhere. That's not too exciting. What I am seeing that I can recognize here are turkey tracks and wandering around in different directions. So these things you see right in front of me, okay, these are turkey tracks in deep snow. Okay, that may be hard to believe, but what you can sort of see here, turkeys have 3 fingers, if you will, okay, and then they drag their middle toe as they walk. Okay, so there's a little drag mark. Here's one where perhaps you could see the turkey nature of that a little bit better. Okay, and they drag their toe as they stride. All right, so here's one. You can see the turkey track imprint a little bit better. So they're wandering all over the place here. I see these would be larger, you know, adults, but I've seen very small tracks as well. So there are apparently a number of adult turkeys walking around with some young, probably young of the year from back in the spring. So that's kind of neat to see. When I first came to this area, turkeys were really not very abundant. Turkeys were just on the comeback, but they're certainly around here now, and this was a fair number of them. They're wandering all over the place up here, and that is probably going to be my tracking highlight of the day. So I will keep going just in case I come across something else like a clear fox print. Certainly there are rabbits and squirrels as well, but I'm not going to end it just yet. So let's see what else we might see. Here's a view from the rim trail down into the gorge. And right in front of us is a tree I would like to point out, which is a red cedar. Not very closely related to white cedars. Okay, this is Juniperus virginiana. And this one's quite old, showing beautiful bonsai characteristics of shari and gins and all those sorts of things for you bonsai enthusiasts like me. And here's white cedar right next to it, with its flat needles versus more needle-like, sharper needles of the red cedar. And with that as my backdrop, I didn't find any other tracks really worth pointing out. So I'm going to conclude this episode of a walk along the Little Miami River, and see you next time. This is the Naturalist signing off. Bye-bye. See ya.